Lots of topics were covered in the video, the John Francis video, but active listening was also one of the key lessons that John Francis happens upon. So you have these moments in John Francis' life where he feels a strong vocation for advocating environmental issues. And he finds himself in the type of communication that we often find ourselves in when we care about something deeply. You are pushing your views on other people. You're like, this can happen if you're trying to proselytize people about your religion, if you're trying to convince others about your political beliefs. Any kind of, there's a lot of things that we care about that we unwittingly push on other people. And so what happens is, it's the type of competitive communication that I was talking about. We in those situations, we tend to not be very good at listening. We focus more on the talking and wanting to be heard, saying what we want to say, instead of, and we forget about listening to others. So what happens, John Francis talks about that, when we only half listen. We tend to have a sense that we know what the other person is going to say. Like, imagine you're a liberal and you're listening to a conservative. After a while, you're like, oh, I know that argument. I know exactly what you're going to say, And I have my response ready, or I'm preparing my response to that. So you stop listening to the subtlety of the argument that the other person is going to make. Another thing is we tune out, we daydream, we think about something else. And John Francis correctly explains that this eliminates communication. This really damages communication. So an alternative to that, he had an extreme version of that, which was to make a vow of silence. But you don't have to be that extreme and do it for 17 years or for a year. But an alternative to that is active listening. And in a way, we've been practicing, hopefully, some of that in the T groups. But the idea is that you slow the rhythm of communication and you really focus your attention, your awareness, entirely on what the other person is trying to say, including what they're not trying to say, but they're still saying, what they're communicating with their nonverbal communication. That's what active listening is about. That's what therapists practice. A therapist is supposed to be entirely, completely focused on their patients so that they can hear even what the patient is not hearing. So that's active listening. Obviously, active listening involves, for the most part, being silent. Not completely silent, but not having a story that you want to use to hijack the other person's story. That happens often. I'm starting to tell a story, and we might do this because we're just excited. We're like, oh, I had the same thing happen to me. This is my story. We might be competitive and want to top the other person's story, their own story. Quite often, that's an interesting one, because we want to help the other person. Our desire to help stops us from listening. This is what I call the fixing flow. I tend to fall prey to that quite often. I don't know if it's a guy thing. I think guys tend to be more likely to do that, although women do it as well. Your friend or your girlfriend tells you a story of something bad that happens to her at work or something that her friend did. First reaction is, here's what you should do. Let me give you the advice. That's how we feel like we want to provide support by providing a solution. Therapists, really, that's a big no-no in therapy. You don't provide a solution for the patient because that's not necessarily the solution the patient wants. You need to let them figure out what they really want in their own words, in their own worldview, something that fits them. And furthermore, what's the solution? Part of the desire for providing a solution is to help the other person, but another part is to stop the suffering associated with fully understanding the problem. So the more intolerant you are to feelings and to suffering, the more likely you are to jump in helping others before you fully understood what they need help with. Right? So it takes a lot of patience and self-discipline to say, let me hear the whole story. Let me be silent. Let me hear exactly what is going on, what the person is feeling. So being silent is important. Being fully conscious. Some of us, it's hard for us to be fully conscious when we have to be silent. So I'm guilty as charged here. I'm an extrovert. I like to talk. It's hard for me to be quiet. So, when I have to observe my own desire to jump in and talk and keep it at bay and not tune out as a result of that and start tune out from what the other person is saying and go with the flow of my thoughts of what I would like to say or what my own story is. So in a way, active listening is not unsimilar to meditation, the type of mindfulness that we've been talking about. You have to be mindful of your own inner process when you are listening to somebody else so that you can continue to actively listen. So you will notice when you listen to somebody else, when you hear the other person, you will tend to say, oh, I had a similar experience or not. Or you might tend to judge what the other person is saying. I don't like that. Or I would think of it differently. Or I have a solution there. Or I think this is wrong. So you might notice all of that. Or you might think, oh, this is so boring. You might have emotional reaction. This is so, it's hard to listen to. Like if somebody tells you some story of suffering that they have, you might find it too hard to listen because you're empathetically feeling the suffering, but you can't take it, right? So that can be another way in which you tune out. You sort of escape the situation. So it takes a lot of courage, fortitude, discipline, ability to be in the present to practice active listening. That's why good therapists are not made like that. It takes practice, years of failing at active listening. Of letting your judgment appear, of letting your thoughts disrupt you, before eventually you master the art of active listening. So there are a few, I will say at the heart of active listening, what you want is mindfully being present with the other person, and you're willing to be influenced, be touched by what the other person is saying. I'll say this is key. You might have noticed at the end of the John Francis speech, he says something that might seem odd, which is if my being here, my presence here, what I'm saying touches you, then let it be, right? Meaning let it touch you. It's an invitation to the way I influence you is, potentially disrupting your own worldview, sometimes in a positive way, sometimes in a disruptive way. Can you let it be? Can you accept that? We talked about it in a Gestalt therapy. Interacting with others is like the point of it's having a point of contact between yourself and another person. That's kind of an intimate encounter. When we are in contact with others, one of the first things we think about is, do I want to be in contact with that thing, with that person? Right? Is it, before we even decide whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, do I trust that other person? Do I trust their intentions? That thing wants to influence me. Do I trust the influence it wants to have? Before we allow somebody or some influence in, we have to make that judgment. So first judgment is like, it's okay. That person doesn't want to hurt me. Second thing might be, well, I actually somewhat, I'm willing to give the benefit of the doubt to that other person. And then they might be correct. They might not have bad intentions. They might actually be trying to potentially have a positive influence on me. Right? So a lot of those decisions happen when we interact with another. So can you lower your defenses, allow the contact to happen, and allow what the other person is expressing to touch you, right? To move you, to have, to provoke feelings in you. Empathy is about that. You have feelings. You feel what the other person is feeling. You're experiencing somewhat what the other person is experiencing. You're accompanying the other person in their experience in a full fundamental way. Right? That's quite scary, quite difficult to do that. So that's why that's why active listening is so difficult. Is that many of us we don't trust others. We don't want intimate contact with others. We are afraid of who we might become if we allow others to influence us, to touch us. We're not sure. We're defending the hard-won edifice of our belief. Our worldview is sacrosanct in a way. It's a cathedral. It's our fort. Right? Can we relax it? Can we say, okay, well, let me allow somebody in my house and let them maybe change my house? That's sort of like, so in my experience of active listening for years, I have found that really, I find it amazing when you allow yourself to be touched by others, to be changed by others, and also to sort of relax about the fact that even if you allow yourself to be touched by somebody else, it doesn't mean that it's going to completely change your worldview like that. Your worldview is fairly stable. So can you have a stable but flexible, open-minded worldview? That's kind of like what we're talking about here. Active listening requires that. So therapists, I've read hundreds of self-reflection papers. I've coached a number of people. So I've heard all kinds of stories. I've been in contact with all kinds of emotions and feelings. I've been touched by countless people. And with that experience comes a great degree of ability to understand that people have a wide variety of experiences and relaxedness of it, non-judgment of it. So I can fairly say that I'm pretty non-judgmental, I'm pretty loving, I'm not scared to hear people's worldviews, to get in touch with them. But I realized that a lot of people are not. That when I started my journey, I was not as good as I am now. So what I'm inviting you is to do like a John Francis journey and realize that active listening is an essential skill that you can start practicing right now. So in addition to self-exploration, active listening is a way to explore other people's worldviews. Now, if you're willing to explore other people's worldviews, you have to realize that you're not going to come out of that unscathed, unchanged. You will be changed by it. So now, let me put this other thing out there. I suggested earlier in the class that most of us are not very good at feeling our emotions, expressing them, not comfortable with our emotions. And that's an impediment to being good at active listening. So if somebody is expressing an emotion that you yourself don't tolerate in yourself, like let's say it's very hard for you to experience fear, so you repress it every time you feel it. If somebody comes to you and expresses something they're afraid of, chances are that you won't be able to tolerate another person expressing what you cannot tolerate in yourself. The journey of self-exploration and exploring others through active listening works hand in hand. So the more comfortable you become with yourself and with the different parts of yourself, the more likely you're going to be comfortable with other people. And the more you allow yourself to be comfortable with others who are different from you, the more you're going to discover, that thing that this other person has, I have it in myself too, but I just didn't realize it up until now. That's how vicarious learning occurs in T groups. Right? When somebody expresses something, when somebody has the courage maybe to express something that you don't have the courage to realize in yourself, maybe that gives you the courage to explore it in yourself. Does that make sense? So it's a very interesting journey to be had. Techniques that can help beyond the fundamental orientation of active listening, which is mindfulness and acceptance and suspending judgment. Things you can do are paraphrasing. So paraphrasing is repeating what the other person has said. There's two versions of that. There's a hard version where you try to repeat word for word what the other person has said. Now, that's extremely hard to do because if somebody speaks for 2 minutes, it might be very hard to remember the exact words. But that said, if you do it in small segments, it can be immensely interesting to realize which words you substitute for other words. So it's very hard. Most of us fail at repeating exactly word for word what somebody else has said. And in doing so, what we do is we always translate what another person is saying through our own experience. And when we forget a word or use another one, we're changing what the other person has said. So sometimes it's not important, sometimes it is important. Part of not hearing what another person is saying is doing that, editing what the other person is saying, filling the blanks. So in paraphrasing, you realize where you've done that. A soft version of paraphrasing is repeating what the other person has said in your own words. Paraphrasing is a very powerful, therapeutic tool. If you listen to somebody tell you about some difficulty they experience and you repeat back to them exactly what they've told you, you will have wide range. People will tell you, "Oh my God, you helped me so much." Absolutely, you're so right. I didn't see it. If somebody has told you exactly what their problem is, and you're just repeating back to them what you've heard, and hearing back what you've said to somebody, having been listened to and been told back, is immensely helpful sometimes. Sometimes it's exactly what we need. We realize it, because when we say things, we don't fully realize them. So remember how I was talking about dream analysis. Having a dream is one thing. It's like a way to become aware of something. Remembering the dream is higher in the degree of awareness. Writing down the dreams is higher. Verbalizing it to somebody else is higher. Now having somebody else tell you back what you've said, that's even higher in the degree of awareness. When you have a group, like a T group, and you have multiple people say back to you different things you've said, that's even more powerful. Now your degree of awareness reaches a level that's is really likely to provoke some breakthrough, some change in you. So paraphrasing, very important in active listening. Inquiring. When we don't understand something, we're used to filling in blanks, to making assumptions. And quite often we're incorrect in our assumptions. Sometimes we are, but so when you don't understand something, when somebody tells you something and you're not sure, asking an open-ended question is very helpful. Typical therapist favorites. And how does that make you feel? Right? How do you feel about that? But that's an open-ended question. A closed-ended question, you probably have studied that in surveys, is an answer is a question that can only be answered by yes or no. So if I was having let's say a disagreement with a friend of mine, and I'm asking my friend, "Are you upset at me, yes or no?" That's a closed-ended question. Right? Now I'm cornering the other person into only having one feeling, like I'm upset at you, yes or no. When maybe what the other person wants to say is more subtle than that. So an open-ended way to inquire is like, you seem upset at me, but I'm not sure. Like, how are you feeling? What's going on? That's an open-ended question. The other person can say whatever they want to say.